Hello and welcome to Wisconsin's Path Forward, Election and Redistricting. It's another virtual public issues forum in our Making Democracy Work series from the League of Women Voters of Dane County. I'm Joy Cardine. I'm a member of the Dane County League's Programming Committee. I'm also a League of Women Voters of Wisconsin board member, and I'm a retired Wisconsin public radio talk show host, where I had the privilege of interviewing our first speaker many times about all things political, including the results of the ongoing Marquette University Law School poll that he directs. Professor Charles Franklin will give us his analysis of last week's election results, how Wisconsin voted and why, and what it might mean for all of us here in Wisconsin in the coming year. And then in the second half of our forum, we will zero in on redistricting reform and whether we will be able to end partisan gerrymandering in Wisconsin. We'll take your written questions for our speakers when they are done presenting. Please post them again in the chat session. And we have a lot of people entering the program right now. Please mute your microphones by clicking on the microphone icon. So I'm asking everybody to please mute your microphone so we don't hear extraneous noise. Thank you. So we are going to start by talking about that wild ride of an election with Charles Franklin, professor of law and public policy at Marquette University. He is a nationally recognized government scholar and pollster. He has been the director of the Marquette University Law School poll since its inception in 2012. Before joining the Marquette faculty, he was a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thanks for joining us, Professor Franklin. How are you holding up?
Well, I'm getting by. I think I'm looking forward to Thanksgiving week and
Well, that's not good news. We just,
I'm back.
There we go.
I'm back. Well, there's still some unmuted folks, but we'll see how we do this. So I'm glad to be here. And Troy, you can hear me, correct?
Yes,
no.
yes.
Okay, just a little uncertainty about the technology here. I want to talk a little bit. I want to just briefly mention the polling and then move on to the election results. I'm happy to talk about polling in the Q&A, but I think the election results are the things that are actually more important at this point. I will say that in my Marquette Law School poll, we had Biden leading by about 3 points in the model for high turnout, and League of Women Voters, we had tremendously high turnout. I had thought about 3.2 million would be a high turnout, a really high turnout, and we're only a little bit under 3.3 million. For comparison, we were just under 3 million 4 years ago. So this is really quite a major step up in turnout this time. So as I said, we had Biden ahead by 4 there. He's leading by just under 1, so we're off by about 3 points. And in our normal turnout model, which would have been still a high 3.1 million turnout, we had Biden ahead by 5, so a 4-point error. I think one of the confusions that's being reported is that there was a cluster of polls that had Biden up by 9, 10, 11 points. And those were much further off. And they're getting, I think, kind of dominating the impression that's been given. But there was some variation in that. And, you know, I'm going to say that I think we were a little bit off, but not that far off. Our average error, by the way, is 2.1 points. And so to be off by 3 or 4 in this election, I didn't think was a particularly bad problem.
All right, and I'm sorry, Professor Franklin. We're gonna ask one more time to mute. The reason why we can't have Georgiana mute all mics is that would mute Professor Franklin and it would mute me as well.
Try muting everybody, and I can try unmuting. I think that worked a minute ago and might be the most effective. Yes, and now I'm back on. And Troy, you need to unmute so I can hear you, but hopefully this will solve the issue.
Mhm.
Uh, this is the joys of Zoom that we've been living with for 7 months now, but
Right, right.
it's still a joy of Zoom. Anyway, what I was saying is there was some variety in the polling. We were a little bit off, but less off by far than we were 4 years ago. There are still issues, and not for a moment am I trying to tell you there were no issues with the polling. But I spoke throughout the year, and especially throughout the fall, that the Marquette poll was consistently seeing a 4 or 5 point Biden lead. But a number of other polls were in that 8 to 11 point range and portraying a much bigger blowout. If I can say it, put it in perspective, and now I'm going to transition into talking about the vote. 4 of our last 6 presidential elections have been decided by less than 1 percentage point. All 4 of those were decided by less than 23,000 votes on the margin. And for comparison, Barack Obama in 2008, in the massive landslide of that year, won the state by just under 14 points. But in his reelection in 2012, he won the state by just under 7. So when we were seeing polling in the fall in the 8, 9, 10, 11 range, we were actually seeing polling that was saying, here a non-incumbent challenger to a sitting president was going to do better than Obama in his reelection in a year that he was doing pretty well in job approval and the economy and so on. And I think I tried to point out that, we were seeing a steady 4 or 5 point lead, which itself was, pretty good performance, but it would still be a bit below what Obama had done in 2012. So this is a big problem going forward, that we had so many polls that were in that consistent range. Now, you've probably heard of the 17 point lead in the ABC Washington Post poll, because that's a shiny object that simply can't be ignored, but it should be ignored. That was far away from everybody else and should have just been dismissed out of hand. But what you couldn't do is dismiss the 9, 10, and 11 point polls when there were so many right in that group. And the contrast between that group and where the Marquette poll was pretty striking. And now we know where it turned out, less than 1%, 3 points, 4 points closer than I had it, but still nothing close to that double-digit lead that we were seeing in some of the polling. So those are issues, and again, we can talk about why that is and other things later if you want to. But I said this is the 4th out of 6 elections to be decided by one digit, really a decimal point, less than 1%. Let's think a little bit about what happened and what changed from 4 years ago. And at one level, not much changed. Only 2 counties flipped. Sauk and Door counties both had voted for Trump 4 years ago and switched to Biden this time. No other county went the other way from Clinton to Trump. And so that was all the change there was, and fairly modest swings in both of those places. If you look at the map of how we voted this time, in many ways, it's a familiar looking map. Most of the eastern half of the state votes Republican, with Milwaukee County being the prominent counterexample, and now this time Door County, and Menominee in the north, which is a very Democratic county. Here in the south central part of the state, we of course have Madison and Dane County, which is the Democratic strongholds. Added this time Sauk, that I have mentioned flipped, but also Iowa, Greene, and Rock counties are the other Democratic areas here in the south central part of the state. Add to that, we have La Crosse and Eau Claire, 2 university cities and medical facilities, especially in Eau Claire, and Portage County in the central part of the state. And finally, up north, we have the Lake Superior counties of Bayfield, Ashland, and Douglas counties, and those are routinely blue Democratic areas. Other than that, I don't think I've missed anything that voted Democratic. So it's a fairly small number of Democratic counties, but in the case of Dane and Milwaukee, two very large counties that also produce very big Democratic majorities. This time, both of them produced a net majority for Biden of just over 180,000 votes. That's pretty remarkable, especially when you consider that Dane County is a good bit smaller than Milwaukee County, but Dane is punching above its weight for Democratic candidates, and of course has been for a while. But the thing about Dane that's worth understanding is it has been the fastest growing county in the state for more than a decade. Often newcomers to a place take a while to settle in before they start voting at high rates. But that hasn't seemed to be the case with Dane, despite our high growth rate, and not to mention our younger than average population, because young people also typically turn out less. Dane has continued to be in the top 5 nationally in voter turnout of counties above about 10,000 people. And so it's remarkable that our growth has also been accompanied by increasing voter turnout, and then on top of that, increasingly huge Democratic margins. So as I said, a little over 180,000 net Democratic votes here, about 1,000 or 2,000 more out of Milwaukee County, but that's all, not much difference. I'll also say that it begs the question of whether this trend can possibly continue. I remember back in 2012 or so telling the story in reverse about Brookfield. They are right on the Milwaukee border, Milwaukee County border. Brookfield was seeing turnouts over 90% of voting age population. It was phenomenally high turnout and very big Republican margins. And so the question for Republicans that I had at that point is there any more water you can get out of this stone? And now I think I turn that around to Democrats and say, can you continue to count on Dane's still growing, still adding to the margins? Well, every time I've asked that question, the next election has shown that yes, Dane can produce even bigger margins. But it is something to think about going forward, that Dane has been the real fuel in the Democratic rocket in statewide elections in recent years. If we switch the question a little bit, not to who won, but how have things shifted over the recent past, including since 2016, then there's an interestingly different picture. So the WOW counties have been and remain one of the great strengths of the Republican Party in the state. But the margins by which Republicans are winning the WOW counties have been falling in recent years. This year, they fell for President Trump compared to 4 years ago, but they also fell for Governor Walker in 2018 compared to the margins he got there in 2014. Likewise, Tammy Baldwin did better in the WOW counties in her 2018 race than she had done in her 2012 first election. And finally, in the 3 nonpartisan Supreme Court elections since 2017, the WOW counties have also voted less for the conservative candidate than they had in previous close Supreme Court elections. So in part, this is in line with the shift in the suburbs nationally of becoming less Republican. But it's particularly striking here in Wisconsin when we think of how strong the Republican Party has been in the WOW counties. I want to just cite a couple of numbers for you. In 2012, Ozaukee County cast a net 17,000 vote margin for the Republican Mitt Romney. This year, they voted for Trump, but by only 7,000 votes. So that's a net drop of 9,500 votes over the last 8 years. And in Waukesha County, for Romney, he won the county by 84,000. This year, Trump won it by just under 56,000 for a net drop of 28,000 votes. So in just those two counties alone, the Republican presidential candidate was getting 38,000 fewer votes. That matters a lot in a statewide election where the only thing that matters is how you add up the total net vote. And the person that has the positive net vote wins, and the one with the negative vote loses. So it's really important. I will point out that congressional candidates in these counties ran a bit ahead of Trump on Tuesday. And so the changes are a little different if we shift and look at Congress. But I would bring you back to the 2018 gubernatorial election, because the Wow counties had been part of Governor Walker's solid base throughout his political career, and certainly his career as governor. So to see a substantial drop for him in those counties, I thought was pretty telling. And it shows that it's not simply a Donald Trump phenomena. It carries over to, one of our most successful governors in terms of electoral success. But in that case, Ozaukee County had the biggest swing in percentage terms away from Walker. The second biggest swing away from him was Waukesha County. And then the third was Dane County. And so, again, let me stress, Republicans are still winning the Wow counties, but those margins have been going down. What we saw on Tuesday night or Wednesday morning, or in the days since as we've counted the ballots, is that a similar kind of shift is taking place in the Fox Valley, in Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago counties. But it is smaller in its size and later in its development than what we're seeing in the Wow counties. In the Fox Valley, this has been a shift in the cities, especially in Green Bay and Appleton and the other cities in those Fox Valley counties. But it has been growing a bit. Tammy Baldwin actually won those three counties. Tony Evers won the cities, but didn't win the rest of the counties in that region. And so that's another shift that's taking place. If you think of the map and draw a diagonal line from Green Bay down to the Iowa and Minnesota corner down there in Grant County, most of the counties to the southeast of that line, even though many of them are still Republican, are following along with the Wow counties and giving somewhat smaller margins to the Republicans. But the great growth in strength for the GOP is the counties to the northwest of that diagonal line, with some exceptions like La Crosse. But for the most part, those northern and western counties became more Republican for Scott Walker in 2018 than they had been 4 years earlier, even though he was losing and his overall vote fell by about 7 net points. Nonetheless, the Northwest became substantially more favorable to Walker. Fewer, but still a number of those counties also shifted against Baldwin, with her doing less well in that northwestern segment of the state than she had 4 years earlier. Now, careful, she won by a big margin, so she actually did well in some of those counties. But the shift is clearly still there. Also, the Supreme Court races that I mentioned, conservative candidates are doing better in the Northwest. So what we're seeing in the state is not so much a shift in the balance of the state. Remember, I opened with saying 4 of the last 6 elections have been decided by less than a point. 2 of those elections were 2000 and 2004. The other 2 are the 2 most recent presidential elections. The margins were just about the same, less than 1 point. But the distribution of the vote between the Southeast and the Northwest is something that's changing. That'll have implications as we go forward for representation. In the second half of the program, as you talk about districting issues, this will be an interesting shift. Also, I'm not going to get into it, but if you look at the legislative races, two of the seats that flipped from Republican to Democratic are in the Milwaukee area suburbs. And again, I think that reflects the shifting balance of votes in some of the areas in the suburbs, especially around Milwaukee. Republicans picked up some in the north, and that's another side reflecting pretty much the same point I'm making, that that's a richer area for Republicans now than it was. So I think those are the big geographic shifts that I see that have been taking place. And if I can pound the point one last time, it is that this is not a phenomena specific to Donald Trump. It crosses candidates, it crosses offices, and it even includes the nonpartisan Supreme Court races. What we've seen in our polling over time is that a shift that isn't geographic, but it has geographic implications, is that in 2012, when we started the Marquette Law School poll, we saw pretty consistently in that year about 31% of the state call themselves Democrats and about 27% Republican, a small but 4-point Democratic advantage. As of today, that balance is 30% Republican, 29 Democratic. And if we add in those who lean to a party, it's a dead even 45-45. Most of that change took place between 2012 and 2016, and it almost all comes from white males without a college degree. In early 2012, that group was about 4 percentage points more Republican than Democratic. But today, it's about 23 or 24 points more Republican. No other demographic group that we monitor in the law school poll has shown anything remotely close to that level of change, either also in a Republican direction or a countervailing Democratic direction. And so that's really where we've shifted in the state. And there are some regional differences in that demographic, but I think that's only part of the story of how the regional realignment is taking place. We're sort of moving here in the state and nationally to a, we've talked a lot about an urban-rural divide, but I think we're seeing more and more evidence that it's an urban plus suburban compared to an exurban and rural divide. The suburbs generally, and to some extent, not completely here, have been moving to join the urban areas, while the exurbs and the rural areas have become more solidly Republican and moved away from where they had voted, say, 15 or 20 years ago. So those changes are taking place, and they're driving campaigns and elections. Sort of think about where President Trump held his rallies here in the state. And there were a lot more rallies in the North than there had been in, say, Governor Romney's campaign back in 2012 or in earlier Republican visits to the state that would have focused on the Southeast. President Trump did hold a couple of rallies in the Southeast, but it was striking how many more visits to the state were focused in the North. I want to close with some polling results on redistricting and then take your questions via Joy. We have polled twice about what people think about redistricting in the state. And the question that we ask is, as you may know, redistricting involves redrawing maps of legislative districts for the state legislature and for Congress. In your opinion, who should be responsible for drawing legislative districts? The state legislature and governor, or a nonpartisan commission? And we asked that twice. We asked it in January of 2019, and we asked it again this February 2020. The numbers barely changed between them. If we put them together, 19% say the governor and legislature, 71% say a nonpartisan commission, and 9% say they don't know. It's striking that that holds when we're looking across geographies. 72% in the big cities say so, but 70% in the exurbs, 76 in the small towns, 76 in the rural areas. And even when we look across parties, 60% of Republicans favor a nonpartisan commission, higher numbers than that among independents and Democrats. But I hasten to add, to pour cold water on this, is that public opinion doesn't drive the legislature or the governor, for that matter, to dramatically change policy. Governor Evers has appointed a commission to look at this, but ultimately, when we look around the country, redistricting reform seems to me to have been more often driven by citizen initiatives rather than through legislative action, because no legislature, Democratic or Republican, is very anxious to give up that power. So I'm relatively pessimistic that this overwhelming public opinion will be translated into legislative reform. But I would hold up Iowa as the grand example right at our doorstep, with a nonpartisan commission that seems remarkably effective. It produces relatively competitive congressional elections, and I believe relatively competitive state elections for the legislature. And I think it's been a pretty good success. But again, I'm pretty sure they did that by initiative. In any case, I'll stop there and take questions.
All right, thank you. I want to start with that, Professor Franklin. I understand that legislators in power don't want to give up that power, but why wouldn't overwhelming public opinion put some pressure on them to make the change that their constituents are asking for?
I think it does provide some pressure, and certainly from the point of view of making the case, I think it's an important element of that. Nobody changes unless somebody pushes them to. And so I don't mean to make this sound like a discouraging message. I think it's a realistic challenge to get through. And also maybe have some longer term goals. Maybe things don't happen in the short term the way we'd like. But we see a similar thing with background checks on guns. Over 80% think background checks, universal background checks, make sense. Over 80% think that a red flag law that would allow a court to order guns to be taken away from someone who's a danger to themselves or others. We have a number of issues with big majorities that favor something. Part of the thing is that we don't have very competitive elections, and that very lack of competitiveness means that it's entirely possible that a majority of a legislator's district favors what the legislator is doing. That's sort of the pernicious part about gerrymandering, is that it's not a failure of representation in the narrow sense of representing the people in your district, but that you've drawn the district lines so that they're so homogeneous that this is really not an issue. So that's why I think it's a huge challenge. But I hope you don't take it as saying that it's an insuperable barrier, but it certainly pays to know what you're up against and to come with all of the armaments of this sort of public opinion. Last bit, it's hard to turn it into the primary basis for voting decisions for people. And that's the other part, is big majorities for this, for gun measures, don't translate into votes at in the voting booth on election day.
So in a safe district, for example, a Republican district, that Republican's not going to vote for the Democratic candidate because their Republican incumbent doesn't support redistricting.
I think that's part of the issue, or put it a different way, how do you find a way to make that an issue? I would say that 2018 held up the example of finding a way to make pre-existing conditions a very important element of votes. Now, not saying that flipped a whole lot of elections, but it introduced an issue in which there had been a big majority in favor of the coverage of that, even at the same time that substantial, I shouldn't say substantial, but more than 50% opposed the Affordable Care Act. But when the issue changed to covering pre-existing conditions, we saw that big majorities were very motivated by that. You know, this is a different issue and it presents its own challenges, but how you make those issues salient to voters and salient to legislators is a big thing. I'm going to push just one more point on how do you convince someone to cross over and vote against their normal party. That's become a lot harder as the electorate has polarized so much. The level of crossover voting is very low compared to historical past times when we could see fairly substantial crossover voting, including here in Wisconsin as recently as the 1990s. It wasn't uncommon to see pretty substantial crossover votes. So I think we have a structural problem there. I'm going to say that one of the things that concerns me as a person who cares about small d democracy and our Republican form of government is that in the last 12 years, and really pushing back into the last 16 or 18 years, a gap has developed between how people respond to good times and bad times, and that they no longer reward success or punish failure. If we look back to basically every president from Roosevelt through at least the first half of the George W. Bush administration, when times were good, the economy was growing, we were at peace, Democrats and Republicans alike became more approving, more favorable to whoever the incumbent president was. Now, there was always a partisan gap. Obviously, your party's president got higher ratings than if the president was of the other party. But it's striking throughout that history how partisan approval moves in parallel with good times and how it goes down with bad times. And as I say, that happened through the first term of George W. Bush. In the second term, that started to break down, but only partly. Democrats came pretty quickly after the 2004 election to giving Bush a less than 10% approval rating, and it didn't budge through the rest of his term. But Republican approval did fall from around 90% to as low as about 60% at the end of his term. So there was still some responsiveness there. But in President Obama's administration, after the first year, there was a bit of a first-year honeymoon, but after that, Republicans stayed below 10% through the rest of his administration, and Democrats stayed in the 75 to 85% range, and neither of them moved very much. Republicans did become a little more approving right at the end of Obama's administration. But with President Trump, he didn't even get that initial honeymoon. Democrats were immediately below 10%, and Republicans, if anything, were a little higher in the 85 to 90% range and stayed there. So here we've gone through 12 years and part of the Bush administration in which there's simply no connection between when things have gone better and when they've gone worse. And I think this is a big fear of mine that in a fundamental way, we're not holding our leaders accountable. Republicans didn't reward Barack Obama when he successfully killed Osama bin Laden. Democrats didn't punish Obama when the Affordable Care Act was rolled out and the computer systems didn't work. And we ended up going several months before people could sign up for Obamacare. And with President Trump, there has been similarly no movement on either side in response to events during his administration. So I think this is a big problem. And I'm going through that long thing to say why I think we are in a position where it is especially difficult to influence legislators, whether they're state legislators or congressional members. And it's quite troubling, I think.
Let me remind our attendees that I'm Joy Cardine with Professor Charles Franklin. He is the director of the Marquette University Law School poll. He will answer your questions that you can submit via chat. A whole bunch of people have been joined us late and are still joining us. So if you have a question about the election results, you can type it into the chat function and I will present it to Professor Franklin. So we do have a number of questions about the WOW counties. Some people think we should clarify what are the WOW counties, and for that matter, what are the BOW counties while we're at it.
The WOW counties are Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington counties. Waukesha is immediately to the west of Milwaukee, Ozaukee immediately to the north, and Washington is to the northwest. Washington is the one that has moved less, though it also has moved as the other two. In recent history, they have the advantage of both being very Republican and relatively large, though Ozaukee is not terribly large, but Waukesha certainly is. And so they're in some ways collectively the counterpart historically to Dane County. The Fox Valley, as it's usually called, though I've taken to calling them the Bow counties because it's fun to say the Bow Wow counties. And it also helps mnemonically. Brown, Outagamie, and Winnebago are the Bow counties. And as I say, those counties are sort of central, literally, physically, as well as politically, to the Fox Valley and the Green Bay larger region. That's also the 8th congressional district for the most part. And as I say, they have started to move a little bit, but not as much as the WOW counties have.
So I understand that the Republican support in the Milwaukee suburbs has been declining. Why? Why is it declining?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. There's a little bit of demographic change. The Waukesha counties become a little more ethnically diverse, but it seems more likely that it's either a sort of broad movement of suburban demographics of high education, high income, overwhelmingly white in these suburbs. But where has the Republican Party gained strength? It's gained strength with people without a college degree. While people with a college degree, whites especially with a college degree, have become a bit more tied to the Democratic Party. That's especially true of white women with a college degree who are very Democratic at this point. White men with a college degree, not nearly so much. But if there's been much movement at all, those white men with a degree have become a bit less Republican than they were a few years ago. So I think part of it is that the relationship between education and social class has meant that the type of highly educated white voter in the suburbs is a little bit less good of a fit with the Republican Party. I want to hold out one other thing, though, that I think is probably quite important, and that may be the mobilization of Democrats who have lived in the WOW counties all along, but hadn't been motivated to vote. And there's nothing like motivation to take you when you're the minority in a county, but you discover that you can be influential and important, and for that matter, the parties in the campaign start paying more attention to you and encourage you to be active that way. So I think that's possible. I think, the same thing works in reverse, of course. We have these counties in the Northwest that are becoming increasingly Republican, and that's another good example of where mobilization and electoral emphasis may be paying dividends for the Republican Party.
You used another term that I was not familiar with. Did you say exurbs?
Exurbs.
Oh.
Exurbs being the places that are further away than the suburbs.
Okay.
But they're not, in fact, in isolated or rural or small town areas. if you think about the counties that are adjacent to Dane County or adjacent to Milwaukee County, some of the cities or towns in those places that are close to the county line could legitimately be considered suburbs. That's certainly the case in Milwaukee, where the cities in Waukesha and Ozaukee and Washington are regular sources for people who commute into the city for their jobs. Though about as many people commute out of the city to Waukesha as commute from Waukesha into the city. It's an interesting, nearly exactly equal traffic pattern. That means there are going to be traffic jams in both directions, morning and night, if you're in Milwaukee. In Dane County, we're a little more spread out, but we still have lots of commuters from Sauk County or Rock or Iowa County that come into Dane for their work. Then think of the Exurbs as maybe the next ring of counties a little bit further out. These look more rural, but they often again contain people who commute into a more urban area for their jobs. And then finally, the next ring out is when we're getting into small towns that are relatively isolated or purely rural areas of the state where there's not a sort of town center that people are going to.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions about polling too. How do you reach the respondents for your poll?
Sure. We interview about 65% by cell phone, about 35% by landline. And we use a technique called random digit dialing, which means literally we create a list of potentially every phone in the state, whether it's cell phone or landline. And we select the numbers in a way that gives every number an equal chance to be selected. That's the way probability samples make sure that we're giving everyone the same chance to be called and to be in our survey. There are some other methods that sample from voter lists, and there's some positive and negative things about using voter lists. And then finally, there are the newer techniques using the internet or using text messaging and things like that. But we still use the telephone with a live caller. We're not using robocalls, for example. And this method of selecting people that gives every number, whether it's a landline or a cell phone, the same chance to be picked for the sample.
Have you ever polled about concerns over voting suppression or voting irregularities?
Oh, we've asked in the past about photo ID when that was a issue that was being having a real debate and eventually passing and being implemented. So we asked about that. We've also asked people about how much fraud they believe there is. And we've asked whether more people are prevented from voting because of photo ID and other methods, or whether it prevents more fraud. And one of the interesting results is, by a big margin, people think more people are prevented from voting rather than stopped from fraudulently voting. However, there are really big partisan differences in the perception of the amount of fraud and the role of photo ID, for example. We have not revisited that in recent years as the photo ID issue sort of fell by the wayside once it was passed and implemented. But it is certainly something we pay attention to and look at on a regular basis. I think given the claims about fraud coming out of this election, I wouldn't be surprised if we don't revisit it in the future.
Have you asked voters about how important the issue of redistricting is and how it affects their vote?
No, we have not asked that question. I think we've asked, what are the most important issues to you? And I don't think it's any surprise that the economy and healthcare and roads and education show up at the top of that list, and redistricting has never popped to the top of that list.
Do you find that voters were reluctant to tell pollers that they supported President Trump?
There's been a lot of research on this in the last 4 years. This is the so-called shy Trump voter who will talk to a pollster, but then when it comes to revealing their vote, they're shy about it. They either distort it or say, I don't know, I haven't decided, I'm not going to answer that. A massive amount of work in the last 4 years has failed to turn up convincing evidence that there are very many of those people. On the other hand, we have consistently, and I have consistently been too low on the estimate of the Trump vote. In this election, I had Biden at 50% and he got 49.6, hardly any error at all. But I had Trump at 45 and he's getting 48.9. So we're about 3.9 points too low on Trump. And that also happened in 2016, but even worse. I think that what I'm coming to believe is that there's a voter who is dedicated to Donald Trump, but is not, in fact, otherwise highly politically active. And they're more likely to think of themselves as independents rather than Republicans. As a result, and they're very distrustful of media and polls, given the president's rhetoric. I think there's sort of an obvious reason for that. The upshot of that is that in the two presidential races with President Trump on the ballot, we have underestimated his vote by about 8 points in 2016. As I say, we cut it to under 4 this time, but it's still a missing group. In contrast, in the midterm election, we were within 1.1 points of the governor's race and within 1/10 of a point in the Senate race. And this spring in the presidential primary, we were within 2 points of both Biden and Sanders votes. So what's the difference between being so close in the midterms and the primary and so close to both Clinton and to Biden's votes, but underestimating Donald Trump's vote? At this point, I think there's just a group of people, not a big group, 3-4% maybe 5%, but these are folks that are very much in the president's corner, but also very unwilling to do polls. And thus we have a terrible time getting them to answer the phone or agree to do the interview.
And we have come to our allotted time with Professor Franklin. I do apologize to those of you who had other questions. You will be doing more polling coming up, I assume, Professor Franklin. When's the next one coming out?
Well, I don't have it scheduled right now. Usually what we do is wait in the spring for the governor's budget to come out and for the legislature to begin talking about that budget. And then that's during every 2 years when we're in the middle of the budget cycle, we then poll after there's been some discussion and given the public a little time to learn what's in that budget. And as the legislature and the governor are debating what they're going to do about it. So we'll be back in the spring, but I'm not quite sure when.
You'll ask about redistricting again?
I'm sure we will, especially with redistricting coming up. That will be a legislative issue no matter what they do about it. And so, yes, I expect we will be asking about it. With divided government, of course, we expect that to end up in the courts. But the question that we've asked in the past, as well as what's being done during this year and during this redistrict next year, it'll definitely be on our agenda.
Well, that's a good transition to the next half of our forum. Professor Franklin, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks. So now let's turn our attention to redistricting and whether Wisconsin can reform this process that we use to draw legislative boundaries. And can we end the practice of gerrymandering? Wisconsin's voting district maps will be redrawn next year in 2021. It happens in every state and it happens every 10 years following the release of census data. The party in control of the legislature is in charge of this process right now, but the call to change the redistricting process is growing louder. On election day, 11 more counties in Wisconsin passed advisory referendum questions seeking to have an independent, nonpartisan commission draw fair maps, rather than have the legislators do this, where they can give themselves and give their party an advantage. So what is Wisconsin's path forward when it comes to redistricting reform? I will turn the steering wheel over to Deborah Kronmiller. She is the Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. Deborah?
Thank you, Joy. Let me begin with a very heartfelt thank you to everyone in the Dane County League for all you did to ensure a safe, accessible, and fair election last week. Despite a raging pandemic, Dane County turned out 89% of its registered voters thanks to you. Your innovations, like expanding the helpline statewide, not only benefited Dane County voters, but voters throughout Wisconsin. Your efforts to observe and assist on election day, coupled with your current efforts to observe the audit of the election equipment used on November 3rd, contribute in no small part to the confidence we all feel about the integrity of the election and its results. Though this election was a huge success on so many levels for Dane County and all of Wisconsin, the reality is not all our voices were heard due to the gerrymandered district maps that are currently in place in our state and, frankly, in most all states around the nation. Gerrymandering, as we will discuss tonight, is nothing more than a power grab by elected officials to ensure their future election and the advancement of their party's agenda. The League nationally and in Wisconsin has strong positions in support of fair and transparent map making. Let's review a few of the problems that gerrymandered maps pose to voters. First, when election officials do not have to listen to their voters and are more loyal to their party and their donors, the voters are not represented. Elected officials in gerrymandered districts are almost guaranteed re-election, making them less accountable to voters. As we have seen throughout the nation, gerrymandered maps increase the polarization of politics overall. Being ensured re-election means our elected officials do not need to compromise. In fact, gerrymandering forces candidates and elected officials into the most extreme positions of their party and their donors who support them. In gerrymandered districts, parties can essentially threaten elected officials who don't support the party position with a contested primary to further entrench the party's ability to forward its own agenda and not the will of the people. Finally, gerrymandering is expensive. Millions of tax dollars are spent to hire lawyers to draw the maps and then to defend them in court battles. Wisconsin's current maps were drawn by lawyers in locked rooms, and each legislator had to swear secrecy to see his or her own district map. Communication among legislators was prohibited. In this process, transparency to voters was completely lost. Maps were drawn in a locked room in secret. The census demographic information upon which the maps should have been drawn, as described in statute and the Constitution, was completely secondary to the partisan data. It does not have to be this way. In Iowa, since the 1980s, a nonpartisan staff has drawn undisputed maps at negligible cost. The maps fairly represent the demographics of the voters, keep communities of interest intact, and honor natural boundaries of rivers and lakes. Suffice it to say, Iowa's districts and those in Wisconsin look nothing like each other. As we heard tonight from Professor Franklin, The November election is mostly over. Our legislative members have been decided by this election, and now we have work to do with them to demand fair maps for Wisconsin. Gerrymandering gave us in this election substantially the same legislators as we have had. We understand that bringing about fair maps will be a large challenge. So I'm sure by now you're wondering to yourself, why does it matter to me? It matters because Wisconsinites want an accessible and fair public education system, yet no systemic solution to the disparities in education have been enacted. It matters because Wisconsin needs to address COVID, and our legislators have failed to convene to discuss any state solutions. It matters because our governor called for a special session to address policing policies, and the legislature gavelled in and gavelled out. It matters because 80% of Wisconsinites support Medicaid expansion, providing the federal funds needed to ensure uninsured families, and we are not being listened to. It matters because both Republicans and Democrats support background checks, and no such legislation has been enacted. But it really matters because through 5 legislative sessions, and despite the fact, as we just heard from Professor Franklin, 71% of Wisconsinites support fair maps, we have yet to have even one public hearing called by the legislature on the fair maps bills that have been introduced. Are you asking yourself, what can I do? First, make sure you and everyone you know votes. Partisan maps are drawn using voting pattern data. When unexpected voters vote, it disrupts the calculus and can provide unexpected results. You and your friends and relatives throughout the state can reach out to your elected officials and demand a fair and transparent map drawing process. And when the fair maps bills are introduced again in the next legislative session, make sure your legislator knows you want a public hearing and that you support fair maps. You should familiarize yourself with the tools in the Fair Maps Toolkit on the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin website. And most importantly, right now, you should participate in the People's Maps Commission's public hearings. Let the commissioners know what you're not getting from your elected officials and why that matters to you. You can provide testimony in person or in writing, describing what you are not getting from your government with your tax dollars. In the next couple of days, you're going to receive a link to a Google form that can accept comments you would like to make to our Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court will soon be discussing a rules petition to allow the district maps, if contested, to go straight to the Supreme Court. We must let the Supreme Court know that in Wisconsin, we believe our court system should rise above partisan politics, ensure that all people have a meaningful way to have their say, and allow the lower courts the opportunity to do the discovery needed to inform that high court for its decision-making. I encourage you all to provide a comment once you get that link. Obtaining fair maps is up to us, the people of Wisconsin. We cannot expect the courts or any other entity to accomplish it. And in just a minute, Joan Schwartz is going to tell us why it should not be left to the courts. Our elected officials should represent us, and they should not pick the voters who vote them into office. We have to bring about fair maps. The voter's voice must be heard. With that, Joy, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. And if you do have a question about redistricting and the path forward, you can also enter that into the chat. Type your question and we'll present it to Deborah and to Joan when Joan is finished with her comments. So as we heard Professor Franklin also say, it's likely that the maps drawn by the Republican-controlled legislature will be vetoed by Governor Evers, and that will end up then in the courts. And we have with us now Joan Schwarz, who is a retired attorney. She is on the Dane County League Board, and she also serves on the Dane County Redistricting Committee. She has a brief overview of the legal issues facing the redistricting process. Joan, go ahead. Did Joan unmute herself?
There we go. Hi, I'm Joan Schwarz. I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on Deborah's reference to what is going on right now at our Supreme Court. Unbeknownst to many citizens, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, known as WILL, and former Assembly Speaker Scott Jensen filed a petition. It's called a Rules Change Petition in the Wisconsin Supreme Court. They filed it in July. There's some serious flaws with this entire petition. I'm just going to elaborate on 3 of them. The first one is what they're asking to amend statute 809.70, which has to do with original jurisdiction. Now, original jurisdiction just simply means that there are some issues that can bypass the trial and appellate courts and go right to the Supreme Court. This should not be one of those issues. But they are asking that, in fact, when the legislature draws the maps, that they will go straight to the Supreme Court and bypass the trial court. Now, it's in the trial court that discovery is done. It's in the trial court where just fact-finding is done. It's in the trial court where the expert testimony is given. It would be in the trial court where the people's maps would be held up as a contrast to the legislatively drawn maps. They're asking that that be stopped. After something goes through, an issue would go through the whole trial in the trial court, it then should get reviewed by a court of appeals. And they're asking it skips and bypass that stage as well. Now, this petition furthermore deals with something we call standing, which is who gets to be a litigant in a matter. And they have named what they call appropriate parties. And those appropriate parties, as far as they're concerned, are all political. The governor, the legislators, and the political parties. Now, in past redistricting cases, it's been anybody who has something to say, such as voters, citizens, unions, civic groups. And now, under this petition, they're saying, no, they will not have standing as a matter of right. Those people will have to petition to be a part of a lawsuit. All 3 of those are incredibly big blocks to having the people's maps evaluated and drawn by the people. Now, finally, a group called Law Forward has been formed, and it is several attorneys who have formed Law Forward Incorporated, and they are literally going to, I have to tell you, the day after the election, the Supreme Court set the hearing date for January 14th. I guess they thought we were all kind of busy and distracted by the election. So it got filed the day after the election, and it will now be heard on January 14th. The response date is very soon, November 30th. So Law Forward is working on this right now and asking for input from individuals, civic organizations, anybody who believes they have been harmed by our gerrymandered legislature. Now, this is serious, and we need to have, that's front and center at this point. I'd like to just briefly tell you that in the past, our redistricting cases have not gone through the state court system. They've gone through the federal court system. And it is still a possibility that the maps would go to the federal court. The reason it could go to the federal courts is that 10 years ago, our Supreme Court said, when Jensen and Will filed a petition to have it go to the Supreme Court directly. They said, you know, we don't have a procedure here. And we're not really able to do this, so we'll have to go to the federal court. This has been 2011. Well, they then studied it for years, with retired judges and so on, and came back and they said, no, we still don't have that. We don't accept what the commission's recommending. So therefore we are going to still not basically take it. So keep that in mind as the fourth point, that there's no procedure at the Supreme Court to deal with these redistricting maps. If, however, the issue gets filed in the federal court, it doesn't fare well there either. We had Gilville versus Whitford go up in 2018, and ultimately the resolution of the Supreme Court was, we're going to send it back to the lower courts. So there was no decision at the U.S. Supreme Court. Most recently, and probably most appalling, is that in 2019, the last redistricting case went before the Supreme Court. It worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And these were some of the comments that came out of that decision. Quote, federal courts are not equipped or authorized to apportion political power as a matter of fairness. In other words, they said they cannot define fairness. They went on to say partisan gerrymandering claims are not able to be resolved by legal principles. Therefore, gerrymander cases are what they call political questions that must be resolved in Congress or state legislators or independent commissions. Now,
Joan, you somehow got muted again, so unmute yourself.
okay. Deborah referred to the independent commissions in Iowa. That happens by referendum. Our legislature doesn't allow for referendum, so we cannot get independent commissions by referendum in Wisconsin. We have Governor Evers' People's Maps Commission, but it has not been recognized as legitimate by our legislature. So what's important with the independence, it exists in Iowa, California, and Michigan, but we don't have that as an option. We have only the option right now of the People's Maps Commission, as much citizen and organizational input as we can put in. Now, on the League of Women's Voters Dane County website, I have done a complete legal analysis of what exists. It's under the additional resources material for tonight's forum, and explains this rules change petition in a great more depth. And it also explains the last 3 U.S. Supreme Court cases on redistricting. And we are forming a redistricting commission at League of Women Voters Dane County. Right now, Joy and Janine Edwards and I are on that commission, or on that committee, and we want as many people as possible to join it. Her website would be Janine, JANINE.C.Edwards@gmail.com. Phone number is 608-520-3994. Again, 608-520-3994. Important, I think maybe Georgiana has just put it down in the chat box. So we need to do as much as we can at the grassroots level. At this point, if we are focusing, we have to focus on education and involvement and action, because it is going to go to the courts. That's a given. Okay, so the next step is how we will be heard and in which court system we will end up in.
All right, thank you, Joan.
Joy.
Thank you. If you have a question about the legal issues around redistricting, or just on the redistricting process and our path forward, what's next, what's going on, what can we do, you can go to the chat function and type it in, and I'll pass it along to Deborah and to Joan. There is a question from John and Deb, who say 66 of our 75 counties, 72, have passed resolutions, referenda in support of fair maps. What is being done to get to the other 9? It is, maybe there's municipalities as well as counties. Maybe that's where the numbers are a little bit off. Is it possible to get these on upcoming spring ballots?
I can take that. Yes, is the simple answer to that. And the Fair Maps Coalition in the state of Wisconsin, of which the league is a part, has already begun to put together its strategies for getting referenda question on county ballots in April that deal with this question. This is grassroots work. This is about people in those counties coming together, speaking to their county boards, getting the county board to accept the question, to be on the ballot, and then doing what has to get done in that county to market and make people aware and educate on the value of fair maps and on the harm essentially that comes from not having fair maps in any district in this state.
The question from Linda, the Iowa model legislation was proposed and passed by a Republican governor and legislature in 1980 as a means to save taxpayer money by avoiding litigation costs. What are the chances that the legislature will introduce redistricting in a way that doesn't allow the governor to veto it? Deborah, do you want to give that a shot?
The bills that will be introduced next year, next session, are the same bills essentially that have been introduced in the last 5 sessions. We're very hopeful that as we educate more people in Wisconsin, that more people have voted on referenda question or resolutions in their areas, that pressure will be borne to bear for the legislature to do something different than what they have done historically, which is to ignore the question. I assume, with every good legislative act, I mean, there's a way likely that in a lame duck session now or in an upcoming session after January 3rd, that the legislature could move to change rules that would disempower the governor's veto. I think all of us as proponents of good government, as proponents of representative government, we'll be the first to stand and say, that's not right. I don't want to hatch those eggs before they're ready, but I think the course of action that we're preparing for right now, what Joan has just described, what the Fair Maps Coalition has been working on, strategically for the last number of years to build this awareness, to build that pressure on our legislature to act in a way that is representative of the people of Wisconsin and not just parties and money and the power.
And Deborah, I don't mean to put you on the spot or make you talk more about something that's hypothetical, but what does it mean for the legislature to disempower the governor's veto?
I think, well, I'm maybe misunderstanding the intent of the question, but I think what we saw in the last lame duck session is we saw the legislature come together and do some things that, frankly,
took power away from the
better government. Yeah, and so we have to be on our toes. We have to understand. We have to watch. We have to demand good government. We have to demand open government. Anything that's being done in a locked room, in secret, I don't think any league member is going to stand up and say that's a good idea. That just stands against everything that we want in our democracy.
When does the legislature start drawing the maps? Stephen wants to know.
Well, I can answer that. They probably are already. In the past, they have not necessarily waited for the census data. And I can tell you, on being the Dane County Redistricting Commission, one of the mandates that we are following is that we cannot look at the previous maps that that were drawn by the legislature. We're not allowed to look at the partisan drawing. That's not the case with the legislature. And in past redistricting movements, every 10 years, the legislature has started drawing their maps already. And the very fact that they filed this rules change petition in July, and we have such a short time frame in which to respond to it, it's got to get denied, and we're doing everything possible. But the very fact is that they've started their process already. And they haven't met for 6 months. Legislature hasn't met for 6 months. Justice Kagan, in one of the appeals cases last week, brought attention to Wisconsin being the longest period of time that any legislature in the country has met. So we don't know what's going on because they're not meeting.
Joan, what does it mean if the Supreme Court is where this ends up without going through the lower courts? I understand the discovery doesn't happen and it's not the right way that this should happen, but what is the fear of going straight to the Supreme Court?
Well, the fear is that they do not have the discovery processes at their fingertips. And what happens at the Supreme Court level, what happens at the Court of Appeals level on the Supreme Court level, is that there's no live testimony taken, there's no fact finding done. All of that has to be done in the lower courts. So if it ends up at the Supreme Court and this rules petition is not denied, we're in very bad shape. There's just no doubt about it. There is a lot writing on the response that's due on November 30th. And it's shaping up to be a good response, but there's a lot of work that's going into it. And as many groups as can provide information is really important for this Law Forward group. And that's what they're in the process of doing now, is asking for as many people and organizations to talk about how they have been harmed because their issue is not being heard in the legislature.
The concern being that when you say we'll be in bad shape, I'm just trying to put it in practical terms. There's the chance then that the conservative leaning Supreme Court would side with the Republican controlled legislature and say your maps, the way you drew them, are just fine, and the governor's veto means nothing. Is that what the concern is?
Well, the concern would be is that they would have to look at Governor Vito's veto clearly. And they possibly could look at the People's Maps Commission. But yes, it is a conservative balance up there right now. And it's hard to tell what will happen because they have already come out and they're on record stating that basically they don't have the procedure for fact finding and process building at the Supreme Court to deal with this redistricting issue. But if they accept this rules petition and they allow this to come up as called original action, it's pretty difficult to believe the result will turn out well. The alternative may be at that point, we'd have to go through the federal court system, which would be very difficult as well.
Deborah, the governor did create the People's Maps Commission, which is currently conducting public hearings in congressional districts around the state. Tell us what that process is all about.
I believe the governor's intent was to, again, raise some awareness about the importance of fair maps for the citizens of Wisconsin to get the governance that we want as Wisconsinites. The formed commission now is meeting once a month for the next couple of months in each congressional district, taking testimony from residents of the district and experts. So they inform themselves on the manner in which maps can be drawn, the tools that can be used to draw maps. They're hearing, in these public hearings from individual citizens who are informing the commissioners about what our current gerrymandered system is resulting in for them personally. So if it's, that there's no public hearing to talk about no more gerrymandering. I mean, that's what the commission needs to hear. And that's why I think it's so important that as this, the meeting dates and the opportunities to speak to this commission come before citizens in Wisconsin, we really need to act on those opportunities. We need to let this commission know the harm that's being done by gerrymandered maps to citizens in Wisconsin. And then we need to, I guess we will hope that the legislature uses that information to inform themselves in their map drawing process, that they use those maps against perhaps maps that are being constructed now that are using exclusively partisan data, and that we can create a map that is going to produce more representative government.
Those public hearings resume next Thursday night, a week from today, November 19th at 6 p.m. in the 3rd Congressional District. And I don't have the full schedule and all the details. If Georgiana if it's possible for you to look that up and put that into chat, people can also see that schedule and
yeah, I think that there's the meeting next week. There's a meeting early in December. I think it's on the 9th. And then the 4 remaining meetings, the dates are to be determined yet.
Okay.
There's a question there about where information on the rules change petition response would go. I can give my email address and people could send information to me that I could then send on to Law Forward. That would be joan.schwarz, SCHWARZ. It should be on your screen. I'm sorry, wrong email address. schwarzjoan111@gmail.com. schwarzjoan111@gmail.com. You send me information that I will put forward, get it pulled together and forward it to Law Forward. Because we are meeting tomorrow morning and they're going to be trying to gather as much information as they possibly can. As I say, their response brief is due November 30th. It's a very short turnaround time.
And the Fair Maps Commission is standing up a link to a Google form, essentially, where anyone can add comment. And then the Fair Maps Commission, or Fair Maps Coalition, excuse me, will take all those assembled comments from as many citizens in Wisconsin who want to offer comment in order to submit to the Supreme Court. That we need an original copy of all those comments and 9 additional copies. So we'll be doing a lot of printing, but we'll get that job done for citizens across the state.
Is there a plan for how to present the people's maps to the legislature? Is there any way we can convince the legislature to consider these maps, Deborah?
Well, I think my hope is that with enough pressure, public pressure, that they will, take the maps that are drawn by the commission under consideration. At this moment in time, I don't know if they're feeling compelled to do that, but we'll see how over the course of the next months, over the, the discovery of the People's Maps Commission about what they're learning from citizens, that, all of this is being given some energy through the media. And, hold out great hope that our elected officials will listen and hear and want to be responsive to the constituents in their districts.
And thanks to Janine, who passes along the information on the schedule for the People's Maps Commission is in the study materials on the League of Women Voters of Dane County's website. We have another question. When must the maps be completed? When must, or when do we expect the legislature to have a set of maps? Do you know, Deborah?
The timing for this particular cycle is a bit uncertain. Typically, the legislature would receive the municipal and county maps in the late spring timeframe, and that's because they would get the census data. Now, with the census having been delayed, we're uncertain when the census data will become available to Wisconsin. And so once we know that time frame, then we'll be able to move ahead and understand when the legislature can do its work.
Mm-hmm. And Joan, you mentioned that you on the Dane County, the county of Dane, the Dane County Commission, Redistricting Commission, you must wait for that data to arrive. What Dane County will be drawing its own county supervisor lines? Is that what you'll be doing, Joan?
That's correct. The commission is mandated to draw 3 maps that we will then present to the county board. If they want changes, that'll come back to us. We will make adjustments and it goes back to the county board. But it would be what Dane County has pulled together.
Mm-hmm.
So it'd be obviously we're a pretty important district county, so that'll be pulled together. Unfortunately, from my understanding, there are only 3 counties in Wisconsin that have their own redistricting commissions that are doing that. And so I guess that would be a movement for the future as well, to get more of the counties to have their own commissions do the legwork, because there was, it ended up with 11 of us on the commission, and it's a really broad scope of talent that's been brought to the commission to do this.
Yeah. So who's doing it if they don't have a commission doing it, Joan, in all those other counties?
I'm not certain how it will be working in other places.
Okay.
Typically, it's the county planners,
Right, yes.
and then those maps, once drawn, would go to those county boards. Each county does have to present a map to the legislature. Each municipality first creates their wards and districts, precincts, and then that would go to the county maps to the legislature. The legislature, by statute, should try to the best of their ability to keep intact those municipal and county boundaries. Communities of interest is what that's referred to. And, in order to gerrymander, there's a great disregard of those boundaries as being presented.
Yeah.
So
And
this
one
is the-
final question. We're almost out of our time here, but what effect has ALEC had on the legal cases regarding fair maps and gerrymandering? Do you happen to know, Joan, whether ALEC has any hand in the legal cases?
For those that aren't familiar with ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Commission, and it's been instrumental in getting wide swaths across the country to do the same legislation in state legislatures. I'm not certain, I don't have any current information about how they've handled the redistricting issue, but that would be wonderful. I'm gonna have to look that up to find out exactly, because that is literally, if they have a hand in this, we have even a bigger fight on our hands.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment that instead of the county board in Dane County doing the maps, that's why they've asked the commission, they created the commission to feed into the county board's information. So we're doing the legwork essentially.
And where can people find more information on the rules change petition, Joan?
Well, first I would suggest they go to the forum for tonight and go to the additional resources section, which is where I explain in about 3 or 4 pages if they're looking for an online site, I would think they could just look up Supreme Court rules change petition, and they would get a summary of it. It was in the paper quite a bit in July. It probably isn't now, but I think they could pull up articles from Milwaukee and Madison on it, and they could also probably get information online to get that references to it.
And we are out of time, but Deborah, do you have a closing remark on our path forward when it comes to redistricting?
We're going to continue our partnership with the Fair Maps Coalition and continue to provide education across the state on the importance of ending gerrymandering. Do watch the League's website. We are trying to keep our toolkit up to date, all our links to the Fair Maps Coalition information and their toolkit. There's a lot of data out there, Jones report. There's no need to go without information. We have lots of information. So, but do get involved and do play an important role just by using your voice and making sure it's heard.
Thank you, Deborah, Executive Director of the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin, and thanks Joan Schwartz, who is the Dane County League's. She's on the program committee, she's on the board, she's a member of the Dane County Redistricting Commission. And thanks to Janine Edwards, who also organized this forum. Janine, Joan, and I are on the just formed Dane County League's working group on Fair Maps. And as mentioned, if you are interested in joining us, you can email Janine or call her. Her contact information was put into the chat earlier. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. This has been just a jam-packed evening full of information. And I'll leave you with the slogan that we came up with in the Fair Maps Working Group for the League of Women Voters of Wisconsin. End gerrymandering. Every vote must count. I'm Joy Cardine. Good night.